Consciousness is a terrible curse. I think, I feel, I suffer.
Being John Malkovich opens with Craig, a struggling puppeteer, mournfully lamenting the state of his life. On the suggestion of his wife, Lottie, Craig gets an office job to help pay the bills. He falls in love with another woman, Maxine, who does not return his desperate affections. Craig discovers a portal that transports a human being inside the mind of actor John Malkovich. Craig and Lottie, both in love with Maxine, try to find themselves and their own happiness inside John Malkovich. There is a lot to unpack here, but let's return to that line from the beginning of the film. Consciousness is a terrible curse. I think, I feel, I suffer. Well, what is consciousness? How do our physical brains produce our subjective experience? If we look at the human brain, we find about 3 pounds of gray matter. Looking closer, we can see various layers, and closer still, we see a complex network of cells. But that's it. When you open your eyes in the morning, you see the sun and experience the world, the sights, the sounds, the smells, the sensations that you feel. So we have the brain, which presumably gives us sensations and we can measure it, and then we have our subjective experiences, which cannot be so easily measured. The objective phenomena of synapses and the subjective phenomena of sensations. We call the collective sensations, this collective phenomena, our consciousness. Philosophers ask how the physical brain can produce something that feels so strikingly different. When Craig first enters the mind of Malkovich and returns on the New Jersey Turnpike, he races back to the office to tell Maxine of his experience. He says that this raises so many new, as he puts it, philosophical-like questions. When Craig entered the mind of John Malkovich, where did his body go? And what exactly do we mean when we say that he entered his mind? Was Craig physically transformed into something that could actually fit inside the physical brain of Malkovich? Or was Craig's body placed inside the ethereal consciousness of Malkovich? And what would that mean? If the consciousness does not have physical form and is only the subjective experience of sensation, how is this possible? What was Craig actually inhabiting every time he went through the portal? If the consciousness is only a term for the collective sensations of the human being's subjective experiences and doesn't exist in any tangible way, how can we resolve this? This is called the mind-body problem. When scientists study this problem, they focus on empirical details as subjective experiences emerge from the physical. When philosophers study this problem, they focus on how this is even logically possible. Craig's confusion is not only due to his inexperience with the portal, but because none of these questions have truly been settled. Scientists haven't had the technology to do comprehensive studies for very long, and philosophers have a tendency to find new problems upon the resolution of others. Lottie discovers that Dr. Lester, the owner of the office, already knew about the portal and that he can explain everything about it in material terms. It's pure science to him, and he has everything down perfectly, even knowing the exact minute in which he must enter John Malkovich to take over his life. Although this is not entirely one-to-one, by the standards of the film, you might call Lester a materialist. In mind-body theory, materialism posits that only the physical world exists, and that everything is part of that world. If subjective phenomena is real, such phenomena must be part of the physical world. Material. Reductive materialists say that the universe can only be explained in terms of physics, but other materialists opposed to this would say that even though the universe is made of elementary particles, this knowledge would be unhelpful to human beings when trying to explain human matters like why Lottie and Craig have a failed relationship, or why Maxine is the way she is, or why children treated John Malkovich poorly as a youth. They are all made up of this matter, but this fact alone is not helpful in teaching other disciplines like psychology. Philosophy professor Patrick Grimm once said, People may ultimately be made up of quarks, but the idea of the concept of person in terms of the concept of quarks looks pretty hopeless. Understanding ourselves requires different disciplines that are not directly related to physics, even if the nature of the universe itself can be understood through that discipline. Craig might disagree with materialism. You might say Craig, as it relates to the mind-body problem, is an idealist. He is a dreamer, after all. To subscribers of idealism, the only experience we have is the subjective. Whether or not anything objective is real, it must be a construct of the subjective. In the film, the boundaries of our subjective experience are broken through the supernatural, magical storytelling. If a materialist would say that all things are physical and all experiences are physical, how would they account for the fact that when Craig is in John Malkovich and seemingly has no body, he can still think and feel and eventually control Malkovich without Craig's physical brain anywhere to be seen? When Craig is Malkovich, Craig's brain is, as far as we can tell, gone. He is pure consciousness, which materialism rejects. Craig could only explain the experience of being John Malkovich outside of the realm of materialism. Idealists are not in great numbers anymore because this thinking tends to be more magical than anything else, like the plot of a genre-bending movie. Some idealists even claim that in addition to the universe only being understood in subjective terms, a physical universe may not or does not exist. If we can't 100% determine that our universe is not an illusion, we must assume that it is. Unfortunately for these radical idealists, this runs into a logical fallacy of presuming a conclusion and then asking the opposition to prove a negative. Not all idealists hold that the universe is an illusion, but it is another reason why idealism as it relates to the mind-body problem has fallen out of favor among modern philosophers. Scientists who study all of this tend to lean toward materialism. Both scientists and philosophers disagree on how far this goes, though. In the middle of these two competing ideas is dualism, the idea that both the objective and subjective experiences happen in relatively equal measure, and that both materialism and idealism are only partially correct. Dualists ask, to what extent is the world as we perceive it a subjective construct instead of objective reality? The question becomes not only about physics, but about psychology. Our subjective experiences may not always reflect objective fact. There's an example in the movie. Once Craig becomes Malkovich, the world believes that John Malkovich, the real John Malkovich, has decided to quit acting and become a puppeteer. There is a lot of evidence to support this, including what appears to be Malkovich himself stating it unequivocally. It seems like Malkovich is Malkovich, even though he's not. The entire world, except for Craig, Maxine, and the dormant Malkovich himself, has been fooled due to the limitations of our own subjective sensations and experiences. The only way to learn that Malkovich is Craig would be to read his mind, and in both the movie and the real world, we can't do that. The problem with dualism is that if the subjective and objective worlds are so different, how could they interact? Some dualists would say that these worlds are actually one and the same, but seen from different perspectives. But some other dualists, particularly earlier philosophers, have claimed that the two worlds are both real, completely separate, and interact somehow. Cartesian dualism, named for René Descartes, asserts that the body and mind are separate. There is a consciousness, basically a soul, and a husk of a body that the soul somehow manipulates. For Descartes, real distinction is a technical term denoting the distinction between two or more substances. A substance is something that does not require any other creature to exist. It can exist with only the help of God. I have a clear and distinct idea of myself, in as far as I am only a thinking and unextended thing. And on the other hand, I possess a distinct idea of body, in as far as it is only an extended and unthinking thing. This interpretation brings us into supernatural or magical thinking, though. Also, Cartesian dualism is difficult to accept in the 21st century now that there is so much empirical evidence that the consciousness is the product of physical states in the body. Another argument against it is based upon what happens when the brain is damaged. When damage occurs from physical trauma or disease, our mental powers are always compromised. If the physical brain and the mind, or consciousness, were actually separate, our mental powers would not be so compromised. On second thought, maybe Lester is a dualist of sorts. The illustrations in the books in Lester's home actually remind me of the illustrations in Descartes' work. In Being John Malkovich, Craig is the opposite of Lester, and not just because they have different ideas related to the mind-body problem. They have different ideas about the value of this consciousness, whatever it may be. Craig states that his consciousness is a curse. His ability to ponder his own existence and desire things beyond the basic necessities of his life, the consciousness of a human being, makes him unhappy. To Craig, even upon recognizing the philosophical questions that the portal brings up, quickly discards them to focus on exploiting his knowledge and his attempt to make his consciousness, whatever it may be, more bearable. Lester, on the other hand, is obsessed with maintaining his consciousness. He's in love with his consciousness. He lives from life to life, from body to body. He is all consciousness, all mind, no body. The idea of a portal allowing one mind to enter another and allowing for the mind of one body to be extracted or completely isolated from its own body while it resides in another body is very appealing. This would be a direct example of the kind of dualism that Descartes suggested, the idea that the mind and body are totally separate, a matter of soul. The problem is Descartes' dualism of soul was not so much a revolutionary idea as it was an attempt to conserve old truths about spirituality in the face of new empirical threats. Cartesian dualism is as much fantasy as Being John Malkovich. The mind-body problem is so vexing because the answer to it could reveal potentially uncomfortable truths about our consciousness. That it does not exist on some ethereal, mystical plane, and that it is only a byproduct of the physical brain, which itself evolved in a manner no more special than any of the animals that Lottie takes care of. And when the body is done, so too is the mind, the consciousness. There is no portal with which to escape. Hi everyone, if you like what I do, please click on the orange Patreon link below. That's how this show happens. It's also the only way to request an episode. Also, please like, share, subscribe, and click on the notification bell so that you never miss an episode. I'll see you next week.